we're going to have a recording for the session for those who are able to make it. And we had over 100 people registered for the session, so we expect them to keep coming in as we go along. So my name is Katrina Nihe, and my colleague Anna Schalk is just over here beside me, ready to pop in as soon as I pop out of here. And we're going to welcome today our guest speaker, Dr. Cuisle Forde. Cuisle, if you want to say hi, that would be great.
Hello.
Yeah, and Cuisle has told me she's a little bit of a croak today, so we'll just bear with her. So the first thing I want to do is ask you to register for the event. So you'll see here a QR code. So if you have that facility on your phone or whatever, could you register on our form, and maybe Anna will put the link to the form in the chat for anyone who doesn't have a QR code reader. So we like to keep a record of who's attending our workshops. So that would be great. I'll just give you a second there just to put your phone up to that and see if you can get into the form. Okay, and if not, anyway, Anna's going to put the link into the chat. Okay, so moving on then. Well, I've already introduced us. Now, the main housekeeping around this is that a number of people want to be able to use live captions. So in order to use the live captions, you're going to have to set them up on your own device yourself. So if you go into the More, which would be probably 3 dots on the top of the screen on your bar, and in there you should see language and speech. And in the language and speech, when you click on that, you can turn off or turn on the live captions. So it's probably not on your navigation bar as such. You probably have to go through the More options, and then you go to the language and speech and turn on the live captions. And if anyone has any difficulty and wants to use them, if you can privately chat to Anna there, and she'll tell you how to set it up. Okay. As I said, it'll be teaching and assessment practice in the AI era with Dr. Cuisle Forde, and then we have some discussion and reflective. So we're hoping to have 15 or 20 minutes at the end. And then we're going to ask you what your key takeaways are going forward. So just to introduce Cuisle, who we in academic practice have met on numerous occasions, and always is very generous with sharing her practice with us. But Cuisle is in physiotherapy, and she coordinates the online postgraduate cert diploma in clinical exercise, has an interest in digitally enhanced practical teaching. And I've put a link there into one of the resources where one of the projects she worked on, and one of her research assistants did a presentation on it, and that's there for anyone who wants to have a look at it. And as I say, today's seminar is around teaching and assessment in the AI era. Yeah, so why are we doing this? So the reason we're doing this is that well, we've all heard about AI and the threat to academic integrity that it posed in November 2022. However, it's also becoming evident that these AI tools are going to be used in, to help us develop opportunities for teaching, learning, and assessment. It's not just about academic integrity. So what we want to do in the Centre for Academic Practice is to identify any teaching practices that are out there within Trinity and beyond that might be of benefit to share with everyone else in this community. Today's webinar, as you can see there, will support you to articulate an understanding of both the challenges and the opportunities presented by generative AI in teaching, learning, and assessment. And then to consider a range of approaches that can be adopted into your own practice, which will strengthen, in particular, take-home assignment integrity in a world of generative AI. And after that, we'll invite you to reflect on these and share your thoughts and experiences on any generative AI you've used in your practice. As I said, the session will be recorded, and I've showed you how to use the captions and so on. So at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Cuisle. Get out of this.
Thanks very much, Katrina and Dana, and thanks for having me here today. Please bear with me, my throat isn't fantastic today, so I apologise that, as Katrina said, there's a bit of a croak, and I'm very thankful for the automatic captions in that regard. So I think there's nothing else to do other than to bear with me for that. So in this presentation, I'm just going to go through my experience and one way that I dealt with the potential or perceived threat of generative AI for a module that I lead, which is assessed by take-home assessment. So just to share my own experience, trying to get over this perceived threat and my own encounter with generative AI, which I think is an interesting story in itself. I'll talk about how to react and also how we can start to respond to generative AI. So it's a new relatively new perceived threat to academic integrity. And I think we need to consider where that threat is. So the threat really is that we as academics might believe that students have achieved learning goals when they have not. In a nutshell, that's as kind of concise as we can make it. So really it's up to us to ensure that when we're assessing the learning outcomes, we can do it in a manner that we can stand over. And in history, there's never going to be zero cheating. So that's another thing that we need to remember. But it does also pose a reputational risk and potential safety risks. So, for example, in my area, which is physiotherapy, you could have a learning outcome related to the safe prescription of, for example, resistance exercise. And you might ask a student to give you lots of information on the screening criteria, risks, and safety considerations related to this. Decide that they've met the learning criteria and passed them. But if that material was generated by AI, there's a risk there that they don't understand the safety considerations. And of course, that person will have a qualification in a number of months or years, depending what year they're in. And that poses a risk to potentially the public. So, it's worth considering, and it's worth weighing up what, potentially what we can do and how we embrace this going forward. And obviously, if there's several learning outcomes that are not met, that poses a greater risk than just potentially one or fewer. So reactions were, in academic publishing, they banned AI bots for use in the preparation of submissions. Many universities banned generative AI use for take-home assessments, and some banned take-home assessments altogether. So this storm was happening, lots of changes. And with this in mind, I reflected on my own module, which since COVID only was assessed using take-home assignments. And over the last couple of years, we've reflected as a discipline on the fact that it actually suited take-home assignments, and we were quite happy with it. But as module lead, I'm still starting now to have concerns. So we discussed as a discipline how we deal with generative AI and decided that we would reduce but not eliminate take-home assessments. So that was our team's decision. The reasoning behind this was that we tried to make an effort to have a wide variety in how we assess our students. So the next question was which take-home assessments were going to remain. And the module on which I was leading was to remain assessed using take-home assignments. So my first reaction then was to find out what I was dealing with. So I copied word for word a question from the previous year's paper, and I asked ChatGPT version 3.5 to answer it. The question is there on the screen for people who are interested, and I know it won't be relevant to everybody's area, but I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't done it already, to ask generative AI programs to answer various exam questions or assignment questions, or indeed take-home assignment questions. So I was first struck by how user-friendly the program was. This is free software. I didn't pay for version 4. And I'm used to free software coming up with poppers and blockers and generally not giving you what you want. And this was slick. There were no pop-up windows, there was no advertisements, nothing went wrong. It was incredibly intuitive. So I started to wonder why. And then I continued to feed the AI bot by giving it my data and asking for output. So essentially that's what you're doing. That's the world we live in. The style and flow of the output was appropriate and human-like. So I was surprised. This was my first encounter. I took out my stem and I looked across, and it was meeting the criteria on my stem. And what the ChatGPT produced would have been a huge help to any of my students. So it definitely required tweaking, but it, without any formatting changes, it would have maybe looked a bit odd as an answer, but without any essentially content change, it would have passed. Okay, it met my STEM criteria, and the scaffolding was done. The main points were there. Essentially, the heavy lifting and the hard work was done for my students. So I felt like this was a challenge, and I pushed further. So I got a second question that I thought was more difficult from a postgraduate course, and it was case study based. So this is kind of heavier stuff. And I decided to challenge ChatGPT further. I thought I was giving him a real challenge now with this case study, which is there on the screen for those of you who are interested, and I was right. So when asked to use evaluation criteria, risk stratification, giving detail about case studies, so a complex enough case study with multimorbidity, the ChatGPT was able to list several considerations, and it supported those considerations, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't what I would expect. A radio advertisement can tell you that exercise is good, but a radio advertisement is not going to give the detail that I asked for in this question, where I'm looking for mechanisms, I'm looking for specific evidence. So that gave me some, I suppose, support to continue with changing my undergraduate module slightly, but maintaining the take-home assessment. Another thing I did was about 2 weeks after running my questions through ChatGPT, I found out about GPT, or generative AI, generally detection software. And this is also free software online. The two I was made aware of are GPT-0 and Zero GPT. So I ran my answers word for word without changing anything straight from GPT into the GPT detection software. And it told me that it was likely to have been written by a human. Excuse me. So I had very little confidence in these detection softwares. Now, that was at the end of August, and I have to admit that I've used it since, and it has detected AI generated material as being AI generated. But back when I first used it, it did not. It could be that there was a gap of 2 weeks between it being generated and being inputted. But ultimately, my first encounter with the AI detection software was very disheartening, and I thought, this is not something I'm going to rely on. On an aside, it's not something we can probably rely on anyway, because you can't be sure. It's giving you an indication, a dial, likely 70% human written, etc. It's not something you can necessarily stand over with great confidence. So we know that AI is here to stay. It's free, it's good, it's certainly going to be a help to students. But we also know that we can't let generative AI software mask deficiencies in students achieving learning outcomes. So what's next? So I picked out 5 potential reactions, 5 things that are done. The first is to remove all take-home assignments. And as you've already heard, that's not ideal, in my opinion. It will certainly work. So, but it doesn't suit all types of assessment. It doesn't suit all modules, all teaching material, and possibly most importantly, it doesn't suit all students. So I would argue that we shouldn't remove all take-home assignments. Second option would be to proctor assessments that take place outside of university campus. But if you've got a kind of assignment that's done over a long period of time, you're not going to be able to do that. And the other disadvantages to proctoring generally are, of course, cost and invasion of privacy and all the issues that came up during the pandemic around that. So again, not an ideal solution. A third one would be to change the nature of the assignments. So this one is interesting. And you saw how the case study based question was not answered well by the software, and the also case study but less detailed case study question about the amputee was answered quite well. So it's about what we're looking for. So not even necessarily changing the topic or the subject, but detailing what we're looking for. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the other way to look at this is to ask students to create something, be more creative. So an infographic, a patient information leaflet, great presentations, or write a personal reflection or analyze data. What I will say about that is AI is advancing really quickly, and there are packages now that can make fantastic infographics. There's AI programs that can generate reflections from certain viewpoints. You can tell them what stance you want to take. So even if a take-home assessment today seems to be AI proof, there's no guarantee that it will be tomorrow. So really we come down to the need to ensure questions are detailed. Rubrics should require evidence of critical thinking. It's the how and the why, the comparing and contrasting, that are difficult for these programs and that lead to students really achieving their learning outcomes quite well. So number 4 that there is corroborating grades with Aviva. And this is something that has been used for a long time in academia. It's very old and trusted practice. The disadvantages would be that it is quite stressful for students, or can be, and it's quite time consuming for staff. So were you to ask everybody to come for a Viva, that would take a lot of time. An alternative would be to choose at random a group of students from a class to be chosen to come for a Viva. So students all know that they could be chosen, and then it's a gamble whether they're the ones that are going to be chosen or not. Or to invite those for whom you unfortunately suspect have used AI to go to a Viva. How you would determine that is another question. But it's a good one, and certainly would give you great confidence that indeed a learning outcome has been met or not. So the 5th cloud down here on my slide is to teach about the importance of academic integrity. So this is an interesting one. So this would place an emphasis on professionalism and would guide students to avoid AI use, or at least declare it, if they're using it to support their assessments. Learning about the importance of academic integrity, you might think, well, that's basic, that's mandatory, that's something we should be doing anyway. And it is, but what we don't actually know is whether it translates to higher standards of academic integrity. So this is largely unknown, and I had a quick look in the research and I couldn't find much that gave me much assurance. So although it's nice to do and it's important and it should be done, because having that knowledge is great, whether it actually leads to the desired outcome of responsible AI use is still remains to be seen. So what did I do with my module after having a long think? So the module I coordinate, as I said, was chosen to retain take-home assessment. Mine was one of the ones to remain like this, and that was grand. Now, I wasn't in a position to change learning outcomes. Okay, that was not an option for me at the time, but I could change the rubric. So I changed the emphasis of questions, and I looked for information describing actions, describing processes in detail, asking why and how, and explicitly asking students to support their answer with an evidence base. And I figured that's a lot of change, and that's not something that these students will have been told they necessarily are going to need by the previous year's students, and they may not expect it. So I wanted to make sure they understood what was required of them. This is a change in the question that I put up earlier through GPT. So the original question is on your left, and the changes at the same question essentially altered is on the right. So this is trying to generative AI proof a question and what it looks like. So it lengthens the question, but you can see the bits highlighted in red, adding a lot of detail, asking them to describe in detail, asking them how they would screen a patient. So asking them for actions, what they would do, making it patient specific, so very case study based, and then specifying that they're required to support their answer with an evidence base, which of course AI programs can do, but they've been known to generate their own references as well, which is very interesting. This is the rubric then. So they had previously had a very basic rubric. I'm sorry, this is very small, but it gives you an idea. So for example, I ask for actions to be proposed and clearly justified. I ask for details provided to enable replication. I'm asking for a lot of detail. Now, they wouldn't be used to providing so much detail in an answer. So what was I going to do to prepare them for that? Was my next question. So I decided to give them essentially a mock exam and to get them to use their own rubric. So they gave them this new rubric, said, look, I've made changes. The reason I've made them is because of generative AI. The reason I'm now looking for actions and I'm looking for certain things is because I want to retain take-home assessment for this module. I think it suits it, but I want to make sure that you've reached your learning outcomes. So completely transparent with them. And then I didn't want to have to correct 40 additional essays, which I'm sure everybody in the room can sympathize with. So I did a formative peer assessment pyramid. I got a question and every student had to answer it. So they were given it in one class. Let's say 2 weeks later, they had to have answered the question. They anonymously uploaded the questions to Blackboard, and then I split them into 5 groups of approximately 8 students and assigned them 8 essays. So each of the students had to read and grade the essays they were assigned, and they had to do that using the rubric. So this was the crux. They had to use the rubric. So if they're going to use it, they're going to realize what I require of them. So in the end, then the best essay from each of the groups gets put forward, and then the whole class reads the best essays, which they kind of like because they realize what their classmates are doing. They don't know who it is, but they think, oh, this person took this approach. You know, I didn't think of doing it like that. And it actually triggered a lot of interest. And then at the end, they vote, or maybe that's not the adequate word, but they essentially indicate what they believe to be the 3 strongest essays. I get them and I mark them using the rubric. And then we have a class, or well, it was only part of a class, where I go through why I gave a certain mark to these strongest essays and where it fell down. And again, referencing back to the rubric. So from my work point of view, I just had 3 essays to do and kind of 15 minutes of feedback related to that at the end of a class. But the students got to see what their classmates are producing. They got to write 1 essay, grade 8, and then read an additional 5. I think it worked well. Organization was probably the hardest part of it. But certainly by the end of this exercise, they understood what was required of them and the changes to the assessment being made and why. So again, they had to grade it, and why in the rubric did it fit in this category? Oh, well, because it wasn't justified or something. So it certainly got them very familiar with that. So that was just what I did. It was one way to try and make good this situation. But what should we aim for generally? I think we know that AI is going nowhere, and we need to respond and embrace the opportunities it brings, and it does bring opportunities. So our focus, in my opinion, needs to be around ensuring the learning outcomes are achieved. Okay, and maybe take-home assignments will help part of that. Maybe shouldn't be all of it. So tomorrow's graduates, they're going to need to make decisions, hard decisions, morally guided decisions around AI use. We're going to see a huge increase of AI in our healthcare. That's just coming from my area. I'm sure your own areas, there's huge increases in the use and opportunities around AI as well. But where does this start? And my argument is that decisions around AI use starts here in Trinity when they're deciding whether to run their take-home assignments through a platform or not. And if they do, what they do with the output. Do they use the output to check whether they're meeting things that they had already written? Do they use it to generate an entire answer? How do they use it? I think the answer is yes. But how they use that output, that is happening today in Trinity. So we need to drive that in a very ethical way. So arguably, take-home assignments can be viewed as an exercise in ethical AI use, and it could be one of their first exercises in ethical AI use as individuals. So top tips, trying to condense this down. If anybody hasn't done it, and I know this particular webinar will probably attract people who are into this, so you've probably done this before, but if you haven't, do run your questions through generative AI platforms and see what comes up. It's very interesting. Explain rubrics to students and changes in rubrics as a result of generative AI to students. Ask for actions and mechanisms. Okay, so again, the radio advert can tell us that, I know we need to be achieving 10,000 steps a day, but why exactly that translates to cardiovascular benefit? What are the mechanisms at play? What's happening at a cellular level or at a systems level? That's the kind of stuff it's not going to give you. Consider peer assessment and use case studies. So conclusion, assessment is part of the learning process. Okay, so we can't forget that. Sometimes we think you learn, then you assess, but it's all the one. We just want them to learn. There's a place for take-home assessments, but it shouldn't be the only form of assessment, okay? I think pretty much everybody agrees on that one, I should hope. I'm going to assume this year that my students are using AI to help them learn. I did ask them to anonymously declare whether they had used generative AI to answer the mock question when I did the pyramid, and 20% only declared anonymously that they had used it for that purpose. And I thought that was low. I think it's going to increase, and maybe in other areas it would increase more, or be already higher than in physiotherapy. We need to shape our curricula to ensure there's an emphasis on critical thinking, explicitly teach about the risks. So why should you not do this? What is behind it? Algorithms, we're feeding that now. I think perhaps the reason that GPT-0 and Zero GPT were better, let's say in January, when I was asking it to detect things, than it was in August, was because it's now got those months of data to improve itself. And that included me putting in questions. So, we need to understand that our use is going to feed what happens in the future. And generative AI can be a teaching tool for you and I and for our students. So to end on a light-hearted note, I'm going to insert my tongue very firmly into my cheek and admit that when generative AI program GPT asked me how I can help today, I did ask it to write a take-home assignment for physiotherapy students, which would be difficult for ChatGPT to answer. You can also ask it to generate a curriculum for ethical GPT or ethical AI use in healthcare. And when I hit the arrow here on the screen, what came up was very helpful, and my eyes widen, and I'm impressed. So if this is the kind of thing you haven't experimented with before, it's free, it doesn't take long, it's very intuitive. I think we need to inform ourselves, and the way to do that is to go and essentially play with it, see what it spits out for your area, and ask it to do things like this. So any questions? That's the end. I'll take my tongue out of my cheek.
Thank you very much, Cuisle. Very interesting to everything that you have shared with us, and we really, really appreciate your experience.